Okay, hello everyone. Oh, uh, is that yours? Oh, okay. Okay, just want to do a mic test. Can everyone over on Zoom? Most people are on Zoom today. We only have three people in person. Does anyone is my voice clear to everyone on Zoom? Okay,
It's
perfect.
clear.
Thank
I
you,
can hear
Sharon,
you.
as always. Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome back. It's been quite a while. I think it was 3 weeks, 4 weeks since we've last met. So welcome back. I hope you've missed us. I don't think people in person miss us because there's no one here really. But it's okay. We can continue. I think so. First of all, I think before we start with today's material, I think me and the rest of the deconstructing team would like to take a few moments to say a few words regarding everything that's been happening back home in Indonesia. It's part of the reason why we had our delays as well. I have on the screen the names of 10 victims of everything that's happened recently. We all know about Afan. We're all intimately aware of him and how his death triggered everything. But he's not the only one, and the casualty list just continues to mount after day after day after day. So I don't really feel like it's right to say that we're doing this to honor them, because there's nothing honorable really about being killed by your own state. But I hope we all take a moment to remember them, though. Just as an expression of the bare minimum, really, that they mattered, we know, and we care. And even now, even the most visible of the agitations have died down. That's true, but it's important to remember that in many ways, the wheels continue to turn silently behind the scenes. Demands remain unmet, wounds continue to fester, and thousands remain arrested, many over the flimsiest of reasons. So let us have this remembrance be not only of what was lost, but of what remains unfulfilled. So with that, I think we can start with our material for today. Okay, so it's been a while since we last met. So I think it'd be nice to sort of recap what we've been doing so far over the past 5 weeks, which essentially we've just been building up towards this idea of Indonesia, right? So this was the constructing Indonesia portion of our class, and we ended with Sukarno's speech, Sukarno's text, defense speech, Indonesia Manggugat, culminating in sort of his presentation of this idea of Indonesia. But even within that presentation, and we ended on this the last time we met, we already saw all sorts of tensions and contradictions within even this nascent idea of Indonesia that Sukarno had presented. And so this is quite a nice sort of launch pad for us to get into the actual deconstructing part of our class, which we'll be doing over the next few weeks and really over the next 3 modules as well. So we are going to wrap up our first module with these 3 classes, where we finally begin to deconstruct this idea of Indonesia. Again, so far, we've been focused on Indonesia as an intellectual thing, as a concept, as an idea. What happens when you try to birth this idea in the real world? What if you try to translate this idea into an actual political entity, into an actual nation? Um, these 3 classes will focus on the contradictions and problems as they appear. The first 2 classes, this week and the next, I'll be presenting them. We'll be talking about it. We'll be exploring this through the lens of the National Revolution, which is the moment of political birth, the moment of genesis, where this actual political entity is like dragged out screaming and kicking into the real world. And then finally, we'll wrap up on a session where we try to interrogate Indonesian identity by looking at one of its most marginal frontiers, with minority groups, the Arab and Chinese, where questions of are you the right kind of Indonesian? Are you even Indonesian? Come up more and more pressingly. Brian will be sort of covering this final session, and then we'll wrap up the first module and move on to the second right after. So let's get started. Again, we've been covering this idea of Indonesia. We've been building up this intellectual idea, and we've been doing it with a very specific set of people. We've been doing it through the lens of people like Kartini, people like Ki Hajar Dewantara, people like Sukarno, people who, in Sukarno's own words, dream and pray in Dutch. It's a very specific group of people. We talked about them in our second class when we described them as people who exist between worlds. They're sort of Indonesian, but also they were brought up in this Dutch milieu. They spoke Dutch, they went to Dutch schools, they were raised on these Western ideas, Western texts. Minke, the character of Pram's book of Bumi Manusia, what does he invoke all the time? The French Revolution. The French Revolution, the French Revolution, the French Revolution. These are very Western ideas. And so far, we've been constructing this idea of Indonesia alongside them. But again, there are very narrow strata of Indonesian society. This statistic from George Kahin, only around 2,000 Indonesians attended these Western style institutions. It's not even 1%. And so today we finally turn the spotlight from those who dream in Dutch to the vast majority of Indonesians who don't, who dream in what? Javanese, in Malayu, in Maduris, in Sundanese. All these different people. They didn't go to Dutch schools. They didn't speak in Dutch. They didn't read Marx. They didn't read Jefferson. They didn't read Rousseau. This is a very different world that they inhabit. It's a very rural world, as we can see from Brand's statistic. It's also one that's much more cosmopolitan, much more local rather than cosmopolitan. Sukarno in Indonesia Manggugat, he's talking about Sun Yat-sen in China. He's talking about Gandhi in India. He's talking about the labor movement in Europe. It's a very cosmopolitan worldview. This is not the case for the average Indonesian, for whom their world was limited to, if not just their village, then probably at most just their kabupaten, their regency. So let's start talking about these people. And again, so far, we'll use art to help illustrate this point. So far, we've been approaching Indonesia in this manner, like this painting of Dula, where you have a Sukarno acting like an orchestrator, commanding the masses, coordinating the masses, inspiring them. And Dula is sort of Sukarno's court painter, and he painted this in 1965, which is very unfortunate with the timing, given sort of the content of this piece of art. And we want to move to this perspective. We want to move to the perspective of the kawan-kawan revolusi, not the Sukarnos, but the people around them, the mass. Because we're not just talking about ideas anymore. We're actually birthing this idea in the real world. And in the real world, masses matter. They're the vast majority of society. And to sort of connect it to everything that's going on in Indonesia right now, again, we're talking about a mass elite gap here. That's quite relevant with what's happening right now. It's a mass elite gap that's not just manifested in terms of an elite that is perhaps detached from the mass, but perhaps even an elite that maybe doesn't dream in Dutch today, but dreams in English. So let's get into it. Let's try to reconstruct. Let's try to get into the headspace. Let's try to really understand the life and the mind of this mass of Indonesians, the sort of who live in for the most part the rural parts of the country in this time period around the 30s and 40s. So to do that, I'll be relying on these three texts, and I'm gonna hello. I'm gonna commit a bit of a I just spent 5 to 10 minutes talking about sort of decentering the elites and going to the masses. I'm going to commit a sin now by doing something very Java-centric. All these three books talk about Java and focus on Java, which is unfortunate because that's sort of this perspective from below. So far, I've only been able to read the text in Java. So unfortunately, disclaimer, we're going to be focusing on Java just for this class. But these are three really good texts. I want to give a shout out to Alvin, who recommended an Age in Motion by Takashi Shiraishi. It's a really good book. I wasn't able to read it fully, but I'll be taking some of the segments on Sarekat Islam for this session. So let's get into it. Let's try to understand the mind of the Javanese peasant. And to do that, we're going to start with tuyuls. There was this phenomenon that happened in Klaten in 1985 called the Tour de Tuyul. Now, we're all familiar with the Tour de France. It starts from the Pyrenees on the Alps, and it usually ends at the Champs-Élysées in Paris. The Tour de Tuyul starts from Samarang and ends in the village of Bero in Klaten. In the Tour de France, you get on a bike, you cycle, you win the race, and you win a lot of money, and you go home, you're happy, you're a rich man or woman. In the Tour de Tuyul, you also get on a motorcycle, you go all the way to Klaten, and you also earn money, but not by winning a race. You earn money by going to this tree and adopting a tuyul, and the tuyul hopefully is gonna make you rich. This is sort of if anyone's been down the rabbit hole of like superstitious Indonesian, sort of like occult Indonesian Instagram, it's always like this, right? The sort of black background, weird font, sort of like yeah. But yeah, so you again, the rumors were this tree, this specific tree in Klaten is home to a nation of tuyuls. So what is a tuyul? A tuyul is we have a picture of a tuyul right there, that sort of like kind of deformed baby almost. A tuyul is like a spiritual, it's like a malformed child. It's like this ghost or spirit. Um, um, According to legends, tuyuls can collect money from you. If you own a tuyul, tuyuls go around and they do it in all sorts of nefarious ways. They can break into your neighbor's house. They can like steal all the jewelry and cash, bring it to you. So tuyuls are, it's like having a tuyul is like having your own kleptomaniac. And so, so there was like this parapsychic society or something. They organized this tour de tuyul to sort of Klaten to sort of explore and investigate this tree, and it attracted mass crowds because people, oh, I guess people love get rich quick schemes. So they all gathered there, and that was what the Tour de Tuyo was about. And even this is sort of again, this is classic Indonesian from TikTok. Heboh tuyul di Klaten sampai masuk toa masjid. So they're sort of like talking about how the tuyuls get into like the toa, the speakerphones, the masjid for the azan, and quite tellingly, this, the people in the video were screaming out, "Repent quickly!" So very Indonesian coded. So again, why do I talk about tuyos? Again, maybe it might sound quaint, it might sound ridiculous, it might just sound superstitious, right? How does a myth of a tree filled with kleptomaniac kids attract a crowd of people? Well, it's very tempting to just dismiss this out of hand, right? It's like this is ridiculous. But maybe if we listen more closely, if we look more closely, if we unpack this, there's more going on. So I took this sort of story de tuyo from an essay by George Quinn, and he suggests that tuyos are a social indictment. A lot of He writes that in a lot of cultures, monsters, ghosts, manifestations of the supernatural reflect the deepest spheres of society at the time. And for Javanese society, a lot of these, what are a lot of these fears? What are a lot of these? They're related to money. And it's a fear. It's an economic fear of a new monetized, a new commodified economy. That's what tuyos represent. Tuyos represent a world that is shocked, that is morally and spiritually shocked by the sudden implosion of money. How do these people get so rich? It must be supernatural forces. They must have something like a tuyo. And it's a negative moral judgment. It doesn't condone it at all. Oftentimes, when people own a tuyo, what ends up happening is their family ends up getting hurt or sick, people around them. It's a Faustian bargain. You adopt a tuyul, it'll make you rich soon, but it'll bring calamity to your family. Just as how commodity economics, money is bringing calamity down on Javanese society. That's the subtext of tuyuls. And this is kind of the approach that we're going to take for this entire class, right? Where so much, one, it sets the tone of, again, for much of rural Javanese society, life and the world and society is viewed from a deeply religious and mystical lens. And as people who do not live in that world, who do not speak that language, we are tempted to dismiss it out of hand. But maybe they tell a deeper story. Maybe if we listen just close enough, we strain our ears a little bit, we'll find something. We'll find a kernel of understanding in all of these stories. And let's try to move on from tuyos to something that's a bit more serious. And so Sartono Kartodirjo, he wrote this, he's considered sort of the father of Indonesian history. He wrote this book on protest movements in rural Java, and it catalogs a lot of there's a dizzying array of sort of rural revolts in the late 19th and early 20th century. This is one. It's in Gadangan in 1903. Gadangan is it's in East Java. It's close to Sidoarjo, if I remember correctly, and it's quite archetypical of a lot of the. It's quite prototypical of a lot of the revolts in this period. So let's read the Sartono's description, Sartono's catalog of this revolt, and we'll start to understand a bit about sort of the social lives of Javanese peasants. So he starts by describing the leader of the revolt, Atasan Mukmin, who was born in 1854. So after his parents divorced, he was adopted by a Kiai, Kiai Muktaran. Kiai is a traditional religious leader in Java. And then after that, he had contact with another Kiai, Kiai Krapjak, and he becomes his mentor actually. And Kiai Krapjak is a guru tarekat. Guru means teacher, and tarekat is sort of like a religious kind of brotherhood, a Sufi brotherhood in Islamic Java. So yeah, Kiai Krapjak is a tarekat leader. So again, Kiai, religious leaders. And then he travels and he visits more famous leaders and pesantrens. A pesantren is sort of like a religious school in rural Java. It's quite traditional. And then he marries a niece of a Haji. A Haji is a man who's gone on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. It brings him into the circle of prominent religious leaders. And then after the divorce, he starts to practice healing. He distributes amulets, jimats, and he provides isyarat signs to fishermen and peasants. So again, it's a very religious social milieu. All the social notables that are mentioned here are religious leaders. They're guru tarekat or they're kiai. Sorry, right. And then eventually, within this milieu, Kasan Mukmin wakes up one day and decides he's the chosen one. He's Imam Mahdi. And so his teacher, Kiai Krapjak, visits him, and then they start talking about the prophecies of Joyoboyo. This is a 12th century Javanese king. He has these prophecies of like sort of this messianic age. They talk about Eru Chakra, another sort of a Javanese name for, again, sort of like this messianic figure that's going to herald in a golden age, and the coming of the Imam Mahdi, which is sort of more Islamic take on the same idea. And Kiai Krabja kind of gets into Mukmin's head, and he sort of decides that, yes, I think I'm the Imam Mahdi. And so he decides that he's Imam Mahdi and he begins to act on it. He claims that he's an incarnation. He has a new mission to found a new kingdom in Java. Again, this is under colonial rule. And then he preached that a holy war would be declared against the Dutch government. And this would include the mass murder of all Europeans in the area. So that's sort of how he gets the inspiration to start this revolt. Again, it's very messianic and it's rooted in these deep mystical religious ideas. Okay, let's see how Kasan Mukmin and his followers sort of try to prepare for the revolt. And again, it's similar themes. Again, this religious mystical environment. He assures his followers that the guns of the Dutch would not work and that they would be invulnerable against their bullets. This is very common in very traditional parts of Indonesia. The Javanese call it ngilmu kedotan. It's sort of the art of invulnerability. And you'll have like these sort of showcases in Indonesia where like some practitioner of this would come up, someone would like cut him with a knife and the knife would shatter and he'll walk over coals and be completely fine. And this is what it's talking about. There's also a belief that the Kiai's weapon, the dagger called the Caluk Rancang, had the power to defeat a whole army when it was thrown in the air. And all of the followers, they were proud to take part in the rebellion, and they thought paradise was waiting for them. They were killed in the fighting. The weapon could be blessed by the Kiai, and any weapon would serve if it was blessed in that way. The day before the revolt, they went to the Kiai's house. They started to perform the dikir, which is an Islamic, it's a religious chant, a general purification, and again, blessing of weapons. And then the Kiai distributed a sacred drink, zamzam, water. So again, we're still in the same world, right? It's again, they're not reading political speeches. They're not distributing pamphlets. They're blessing their weapons. They're drinking zamzam water. They're talking about invulnerability. Again, it's a very different world. And to wrap things up, let's sort of just see how the revolt eventually ended. So The next day, around 100 people gathered. So it wasn't a very big revolt, just around 100 people. And a lot of the revolts that Sartono covers in his book are actually similar in size. These revolts never, and that's a key detail that we want to remember. These revolts are quite small. They never really metastasize in an insane way. They start marching, they come to a river and they pray. And then after finishing it, Kasan Mukmin leaves them. He just goes home and he says, okay, I can deal with this. You guys can deal with this. I can handle the Dutch. He doesn't. They don't. The Dutch come for Kasan Mukmin. They kill him. Kasan Mukmin's followers end up confronting the region's soldiers. And again, because they genuinely believed that they were following Kasan Mukmin, the Imam Mahdi, they genuinely believed they were going to be invulnerable. They charge at the soldiers with their sabers, with their pikes and krisses. They were not invulnerable. They got shot. They were all just shot down. And that was how the revolt ended. And so again, it's whatever we feel about running into a firestorm of bullets, I think it's pretty clear that in this world, in this headspace, Kasan Mukmin's followers genuinely believed in what they were doing. They genuinely believed they were following an Imam Mahdi, they were ushering in a golden age, and that they would be invulnerable to these bullets because they were in the presence of this holy, holy man. Okay, so that's the revolt. Let's see how the Dutch reacted to this, because it's quite telling. So the Dutch, and Sartono is looking at the colonial records, and the Dutch are completely dismissive of this revolt. They say that it is merely the product of religious fanaticism, ignorance of the rural masses, a religious frenzy, a conspiracy by bad elements. They had no real reason to protest. These are just a bunch of country bumpkins. That's what the Dutch are saying. The European press says exactly the same thing. The incident was just an outburst of anti-European sentiments instigated by Islamic fanaticism. That's the key word, fanaticism, ignorance, right? And so it's a view that completely dismisses. Again, it's quite dismissive. And this isn't surprising coming from the colonial authorities. But sometimes you get a similar dismissiveness from groups that, maybe even nominally, they sort of have an emancipatory character. And I'm talking about the Marxists. Again, Marxism. Marxists are, again, class conflict, emancipation, democracy. They are equally dismissive of these protesters. Eric Hobsbawm, the great Marxist historian, labels these social bandits, these peasant protesters, as pre-political people. They have not yet found, or only begun to find, a specific language in which to express their aspirations about the world. They're pre-political. This is not a genuinely political movement because they just don't know. Right? He's even more explicit in the next line. This happens because they have yet to reach political consciousness. They are not politically conscious. They're just, probably just religious fanatics. And we can try to understand why Hobsbawm think this way by looking at Marx himself. Here he writes in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where he sort of analyzes Louis's coup when he establishes the Second French Empire. And this is Marx talking about the French peasantry. They are a sack of potatoes. And why are they a sack of potatoes? Well, because they form no community, no national bond, and no political organization among them. They do not constitute a class. And this is the key Marxian term. In Marxian philosophy, in the Marxian schema of things, a class is a materialistic economic entity. Who is a capitalist? Someone who owns the means of production. Who is a proletariat? Someone who doesn't, and therefore they have to work for a wage, right? Again, it's an identity that's defined based on a material position in the world. Do you own means of production or not? And in as much as the French peasantry does not see themselves in that way, they don't go and say like, okay, we have shovels and hoes, and we have a feudal lord. That's why we're equal. We're the same class. We're all peasants. In as much as peasants don't see themselves in that way, Marx says that they do not constitute a class, right? Okay, that's just academic mansplaining. Maybe it's harmless, but it has political consequences. read the next lines. Because they do not constitute a class, they are therefore incapable of asserting their class interests in their own name, whether through a parliament or a convention. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. And so again, in Marxian terms, the peasants are below probably the proletariat. Presumably, and I wouldn't be surprised if certain Marxists came of the conclusion that the only way you can organize peasants is to put them under the leadership of a more politically advanced class, a politically advanced individual. Again, whatever you feel about that, the sort of the contempt is quite clear. so so we want an antidote. We want an antidote to this contempt. And that's where the subaltern perspective comes into play. And subaltern itself was a term borrowed from a Marxist, the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci. He was sort of analyzing the Italian peasantry and he was sort of confused. And he was like, they don't quite fit classical Marxist class categories. They're not necessarily proletarian, they don't fit into anything. So he used the word subaltern to describe them. And that sort of already hints at the nature of the groups that this perspective focuses on. Groups where it's like we don't have a language to speak of them. They don't fit into any framework. There's this quote by Gyan Prakash, a subaltern studies scholar, and he writes that the subaltern is a figure produced by historical discourses of domination. And the key word here is discourse. It's you have a historical narrative. You have a political theory. You have a way of talking about the world. And your way of talking about the world excludes these people. How? Because they deny the subaltern's autonomous consciousness. And that's what makes these models elitist. And what are these models? It could be the model of the Dutch colonial authorities that says that these are irrational fanatics. It could also be the elitism of Marxists who say that these people are pre-political. You deny their voice. And again, when we're talking about subaltern studies, the metaphor of voice is key. One of the most famous scholars, Gayatri Spivak, has this essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And that really gets at the core question. Can they speak? Can we listen to them, right? Again, it's like, can the Dutch colonial authorities speak? They do. We just read them. They have all these records and all these papers and all of these articles. Can Sukarno speak? Can Kartini speak? Yes, in the way that we understand speaking. We just spent so many classes reading their texts. Can the peasants speak? The historian Harry J. Benda has this great quote about how peasants rarely record their own lives. And when their social betters do, they only do so sparingly and only with reference to themselves. Oh, peasant A is great. He cleaned my shoe today. So how do we capture the voice of a class that doesn't speak? Or rather, if they do so in a voice that we are illiterate in. And there's this, we recently had a conversation with some people who were close to certain Adat indigenous communities, and had this great example that illustrates this point very well, where Adat communities, even those from different parts of Indonesia, when they perform a dance, when they perform a ritual, other Adat communities instinctively understand what they're trying to say. They instinctively understand the meaning behind this dance and rituals. And everyone who's not part of an Adat community will look at that and say, please explain that to me. You won't get that instinctive understanding. But in trying to explain the meaning of an art form, of a dance, of a ritual, something's lost in translation. You necessarily get a distorted voice. And so that's what subaltern studies is concerned with. And at least the specific lens of subaltern studies that we will be trying to apply in this class, it's not about saying who's right or who's wrong. Maybe Marx was right in the sense that if peasants never moved to a different stage of political consciousness, they'd be stuck in the same loop. Maybe he is right. That's not the point of subaltern studies. It's not to say that Marx was wrong. Subaltern studies, in what we're trying to do, is simply an exercise in empathy. It is a way to train your ears, to strain your hearing, to be able to pick up on notes that you didn't even know exist beforehand. And today, the notes we're focusing on are of the Javanese peasantry. And again, the sort of the main protagonists of today for us is Sartono Kartodirjo, who is the father of Indonesian history. And again, this is an article from Tempo calls him Sejarawan Ratu Adil. I'm the historian of Ratu Adil, again, that Javanese messianic figure. So what did Sartono do that was so important? Again, we're talking about voice. And in history, voice is related to historical sources. Which texts, which archives are you using? And for the Dutch colonial period, these sources are from the Dutch colonial archives. Now, if you just read the Dutch colonial archives literally as is, you'll come to the same conclusions as the text that we just quoted, that this was just an irrational, fanatical revolt, because that's how the Dutch saw it. Sartono took these same sources and said, maybe we should read between the lines. Let's try to get the subtext. Let's try to get the hidden echo that's hiding underneath this very obvious sound that's just shouting over everyone's heads. And so what do you get when you do that? Let's revisit the Gadangan revolt. Now Sartono tries to reconstruct this with a more sensitive ear. So again, the language might have been the language of dikirs, of Imam Mahdis, of Eru Chakras. But let's not forget that ultimately, according even to the Dutch source, the assault had been made with the specific purpose of overthrowing the local government. This is political. This is a very specific and explicit political goal, right? This is not pre-political at all. It's not expressed in class consciousness. It's not expressed in democracy, but it is political. And Sartono gives more details. The reasons given for this objective are related to the abuses of the colonial regime. Now, some are kind of, well, okay, I'll just read them out. Infidel rule had brought much suffering and misery to the people. Water was said to be poisoned or polluted by water used for baptizing Christians. I'm a Catholic. I shower every day. I use soap. I don't think I poison water. Anyway, sacrilege by destroying graves. And this gets to territory that maybe is more familiar to us. More fundamentally, there was a good deal of evidence that the revolt was inspired by the desire for vengeance arising out of agrarian disputes between peasants and sugar plantations. And all of that's just swept under the rug because they're religious fanatics. And that's what happens when the voice of the subaltern is muffled, or maybe not even, we just don't know how to listen to it. So that's Sartono. And I kind of want to do a little analytical, conceptual exercise to sort of help us understand this better and have like a broader view of politics. Because again, when people talk about politics, they're referring to very specific things. They might be talking about running for office. You draft a bill, legislation, you write an opinion piece for Tempo or Jakarta Post, or you go out in the streets to protest. And these are very clearly valid and political things, but they're a very specific kind of politics. The first two are or even the third, are very institutionalized. They do not exist unless you have the institutions. They're very formal, right? If you don't have a parliament, you can't run for office. If you don't have a parliament, you can't draft legislation. If you don't have a newspaper outlet, you cannot write an opinion piece. They're very institutional and quite historical. Even protesting, or the specific way we talk about protesting, that comes from a very specific dictum, a very specific linguistic of politics. So they're all politics, but they're very formal and very institutional kind. Well, less so the latter two, but definitely these first two. And so when we actually look at the word, we do a little bit of an etymological breakdown, the possibilities are actually much vaster, much wider than this. So the Indonesian word politik, it's a borrowed term. We took it from the West, we took it from the Dutch. And the West itself, where did the word originate? From the Greeks, from the Greek politica. And what does the Greek politica mean? Affairs of the polis. And what are the polis? The polis are the Greek city-states of the during ancient Greece, where we're talking about our Athens, our Spartas, our Thebes, our Corinths. These are the polis. So all the affairs within the polis are politica. Now, we don't live in an Athens, we don't live in a Thebes, but we live in a kind of polis of our own, right? We live in states, we live in nations, we live in societies, we live in communities. So all affairs pertaining to our communities, to our societies, are politica. They're affairs of our polis, right? So any relational act within this community, isn't that politics, right? someone living within a nation state or hell, maybe even a commune, and they're not happy with how things are going. And then maybe they weren't comfortable talking about social issues previously, and then they start talking about them with their friends, with their families. That is politica, because you're doing something that pertains to the affairs of your polis. A group of Javanese peasants are deeply detached and disturbed by material society, by the intrusion of sugar plantations, by the loss of religious values. What do? They decide to withdraw to a remote part of Java and form fauna tarekat or a pesantren. Not political in this way, but when we understand politics in this way, this is a political act. It's a way of relating to society. And so I hope we walk away from this session with a much more generous and a much more sort of light and sort of vast understanding of politics. Um, and now that we've built a few analytical and conceptual tools, right? We have the subaltern perspective of reading between the lines, and then we have this wider definition of politics. Let's try to reconstruct the headspace, the worldviews of both the intellectual elite that we're more familiar with and the kromo, the ordinary Javanese. And again, Sartono suggests, implies that both groups were actually dealing with the same issue, the same problem. What? Which was Westernization. With the increasing intensity of Dutch colonial rule, you had increasing Westernization and increasing alienation. Now, how this manifested for the intellectual elite, we've seen plenty, especially in our second class, when we talked about Kartini, when we talked about Ki Hajar, we talked about Minke. This quote by Kartini sums it up, right? Why do many Hollanders find it unpleasant to converse with us in their own language? Oh, yes, now I understand. Dutch is too beautiful to be spoken by a brown muff. It's this identity crisis of being in between two worlds. Now, for the Kromo, they too felt the effects of this intrusion, of this colonialism, but they were alienated in much different ways. The most prominent expression of this was economic exploitation. We talked about this when we explored Indonesia Manggugat. We talked about Kulturstelsel. We talked about the liberal period, about the vast expansion of plantations, about how the brutal labor conditions in all of these settings. The Kromo also faced a kind of culture shock, but it was a very different kind of culture shock. It was the culture shock of a secularizing force which constituted a direct challenge to the fundamental principles upon which Islamic civilization is based. It was the sense that you had now entered a world where beliefs and values that you hold dear would just be deemed as irrational or fanatical, bygones of an old age, feudal. And it wasn't just the Dutch who said this. Certain members of the Indonesian Revolution, people like Sultan Syahrir and to a certain extent even Hatta, had similar views on such practices. Now, both groups would respond and would try to conceptualize and understand these events in very different ways. So first, let's turn to what I call the Leiden mind, sort of Leiden for, I guess, the Indonesian elites in this period who went to Leiden to study. People like Syahrir and Hatta, they had a very distinct way of understanding this, and we've covered this at great length. They might found a newspaper, Medan Priai, for instance. This was created by Tirto Adisuryo, Minke, from our second class. They might write a political pamphlet like Sukarno, Indonesia Manggugat. They might join or form a political party, the Partai Nasional Indonesia, or they might form an organization like Sarekat Islam. We're very familiar with this, in part because we've been talking about this for the past 2 months, but also because this is the world we live in. We understand this headspace quite well. How would the Kromo, how would the Kromo understand and conceptualize these developments? Let's start by trying to recreate the Kromo mind. And I'm drawing a lot of this from both Sartono as well as the writings of Ben Anderson. So let's start with the metaphysics first, which is sort of the Javanese conception of power and cosmology. Now, for the Javanese, for traditional Java, power is this tangible thing that you can sort of collect and lose. And maybe the best maybe the best analogy for it is something like tenaga dalam. You can accumulate tenaga dalam and you can lose tenaga dalam, or like, I don't know if I'm misunderstanding chi, but maybe that's also chi. Sort of, you can collect chi. It's like, I don't know if you watch Naruto. If you watch Naruto, it's like chakra, I guess. So that's power. How do you accumulate power? Well, you can like withdraw from society and meditate. You can bertapa. You can sit beside a calm stream, and you can accumulate power that way. You can also collect power the way you collect Pokemon. How? You can collect important relics, pusaka, like sacred keris, sacred amulets, jimats, sacred texts. um, by collecting these sacred objects, they confer power upon you. And not just sacred objects, you can also collect sacred people. If you surround yourself with important kiais, for instance, you can also accumulate power. Um, and of course, the further you get from these things, the more power you lose as well. And this is linked with the Javanese understanding of their historical cycles of Zaman Mas and Zaman Edan. When the ruling dynasty, when the king, the sultan, the raja has a lot of power, he's accumulated a lot of power, everything is in balance, and you have Zaman Mas. When the sultan, when the ruling dynasty loses his power, you have Zaman Edan. So they're intricately linked. And I hope this sort of illustrates why a lot of the protests that we've been seeing have this strong element of messianism. Like Hasan Mukmin, he has the signs. He's showing the signs. He has the amulets. He says the right things. I think he has a lot of power. I think he's the guy who's going to take us to Zaman Mas. That's the headspace of, and this is the headspace. This is the same headspace that fueled Diponegoro's rebellion. It's the same cultural headspace. So that's the metaphysics of it. Let's get down to sort of the nitty gritty of individual everyday life. For a lot of Javanese youth, men to be precise, there's a coming of age moment when they grow up and they step into adulthood. And this moment is defined by the search for a guru, for a teacher. It's like you're an apprentice, you want a mentor. And who are these gurus in traditional Javanese society? Well, it's people like Tasan Mukmin. It's people like Kiai Krapjak. They're dukuns, shamans, jagos. Jagos are like, remember the invulnerability stuff we were talking about in ilmu kedotan? Jagos are like sort of practitioners or like warriors who are good at stuff like that. And kiais are obviously the religious sort of teachers, figures that we've been talking about. And so you have this network where all these Javanese pemuda, all these Javanese youths, they go out in search of these gurus. They travel far and wide. They look for these teachers. They look for like pesantrens, and these figures do the same thing. They're traveling mystics. They're mendicants. And I hope what comes out of this is the sense that there's a network being formed. And one of the most important expressions of that network is ziarah, which is the practice of pilgrimage to holy sites, usually the cemetery of a holy figure. For example, say the Wali Songo, who are important figures in the spread of Islam in Java. So these create these networks, and we can see how protest movements can propagate across these networks. And what are the loci? What are the basic cell units of these networks, of these protests, of these revolts? Tarekats and pesantrens, the bond between the guru and the murid. You have someone like Hasan Mukmin, he's a guru, and then he has all of these disciples, ranging from, I don't know, 4 to like 100, however it works. And usually the bonds are very strong between the disciples and the guru. They have to swear an oath of loyalty, the baya, and this creates a very strong group solidarity. You don't have political parties, you don't have political organizations, but you do have these sociological units constituted around the charismatic guru. And these become the basic cell units of social movements and social protests in rural Java. I want to spend a bit of time getting into like the psychology, sort of the inner, the sort of the headspace of actually going to an experience like this, of finding a guru, attaching yourself to a pasantren or a tarekat. I took this from Benedict Anderson's text, Java in a Time of Revolution. And the important thing to remember about pasantren and sort of the culture that grows up around these institutions is that they're isolated. It is there's this sense that you're withdrawing from society. And traditionally, this is just temporarily. You grow up and then you withdraw from society for a while. You try to find yourself, so to speak. And then when you're done, you get back into society. That's how it usually manifests. Again, it creates a sense of weightlessness, a free floating intuition of liberation, but also a feeling of exaltation. You're detached, but that detachment creates a kind of inner vitality, an inner spirit, an inner strength. A sense that, like, wait, I'm above society now, and there's this sense of potential, of power, almost revolutionary. And I wanna, and again, this will prove decisive when we actually come to the national revolution. Um, and Anderson puts it best. The Santri themselves, as well as for the community from which they stood apart, the Pesantren, were concentrations of contained power. Concentrations of contained power. And whenever you have times of crisis, these concentrations of power can be released into society. And that's exactly what happened in the National Revolution. But before we get to that, let's try to sort of rendezvous. And again, we've tried to reconstruct the Kromo and the Leiden mind. Let's try to sort of illustrate, um, like just try to exercise sort of the analysis and empathy that we've built to try to see how these two different groups might respond differently to the same event. So let's take an economic crisis. Here I have, like, say, I don't know, a sugar glut. So sugar prices fall, which happened quite recurrently in this period. Sugar prices fall, plantations start firing people left and right. So if you were of the Leiden folk, right? Maybe you're a student, maybe you're a manager at the plantation, maybe you're a civil servant, you work at a newspaper. How will you feel this? How would you conceptualize this? Maybe your salary starts getting cut. You're worried about getting fired, or maybe there's inflation and you sort of feel your real purchasing power declining. Maybe you pick up a newspaper journal, you read, oh, it's because, there's a ban of imports from America. That's why sugar prices go up and down. That's why you might read an economic text to try to understand why this is happening. You'll go to a cafe, you'll meet your friends, and you'll all complain. If you're more politically active, you might even join a political party. You might even join an organization mobilizing for better conditions for, more sugar exports, I guess. So that's how a Leiden mind would approach this. How would a Kromo approach this exact same situation? So this would probably be a band of peasants in rural Java. They walk from one plantation to the next, one plantation to the next, and at each plantation they get turned down. We have no jobs, we have no jobs, they have no work. And so you're destitute, you're desperate, you feel society is falling apart. Like Zaman Edan. Zaman Edan is upon you. The world feels out of kilter. Who are the people rejecting your jobs? It's these foreigners, these non-Muslims, these infidels. And in that state of mind, maybe your local PI would start displaying the signs. He would start giving out amulets. He'd start saying, I have a prophecy, I have a vision, I have this moment of awakening. And then when you're convinced enough, you'll say, well, that's the Imam Mahdi. That's Ratu Adil. I'll join him on his grand revolt. And so we can see how. Same event, sugar prices falling, but two drastically different understandings and responses to it. So perhaps the question that we might ask now is, do the two worlds ever come together? Are they too far apart? And that's where Sarekat Islam comes in. Sarekat Islam is fascinating. Sartono describes it as a hybrid. It stands between both worlds. It's one of the first organizations of this sort in Indonesian history. And the Sarekat Islam, again, it's fascinating because you go to school and you're taught that it's just a trade organization, essentially. A bunch of batik traders in Solo decide to band together so they can better compete with Chinese merchants. It didn't stop there, though. It expanded. It became this mass organization. And at certain times of its history, it encompassed all the major political strains of Kebangkitan Nasional, of national awakening. The Javanese sort of Priai was well represented with Cokro Aminoto. So were the Islamic figures. You had Agus Salim. You had Kiai Haji Ahmad Dahlan, the founder of Muhammadiyah. You had Suwardi Suryaningrat, Ki Hajar Dewantara. He led the Bandung branch of Sarekat Islam at some point. And again, just recall, he was one of the founders of the Indisch Party. You also had Semaun. Semaun was one of the founders of the Indonesian Communist Party. All of these figures were at some point or another involved with the Sarekat Islam. Um, at some point, we'll eventually do an entire class on Sarekat Islam. But for now, I just want to focus on how this was sort of a hybrid organization. So I start with how it's a traditional organization with the initiation rites when new members join. Again, this is textbook pesantren. This is textbook tarekat. You join, you declare an oath of faith to the organization and its leaders, and then you're initiated to secret signs that only members of Sarekat Islam understand. So you're all brothers now, sudara. And I just kind of want to show like some of the signs because some of them are quite cute. The first sign here is like if you meet someone, you shake hands and then you turn their hand around. And if they turn your hand back, it means they're a member of Sarekat Islam. And if they don't, then well, too bad, like outsiders. My favorite is number 6. If someone makes a noise, hey, 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 several times, that is a sign that a Sarekat Islam member is being struck by someone not a member of Sarekat Islam or being struck by someone of another race and needs to ask help. So if you hear the sound, hey, hey, you should come together with your weapons ready, such as a small dagger, swords, spears, and so forth. So when in doubt, when in fear, hey, hey, hey. Um, so that's Sarekat Islam. So let's get to some of the tradition again. The actual revolts and movements that sort of broke out with the branches, they were steeped with religion. Again, they were quite similar to what we just saw with the Gedangan revolt. And Messianism. Messianism was still an important part. Cokro Aminoto, the leader of Sarekat Islam, was considered Ratu Adil by a lot of these followers. So all of this, again, this was the world that we've just been talking about for the past 10 or 20 slides. But it was also a distinctly modern political organization. There was a very clear structure and had a formal membership. And why was this important? Again, with traditional rural protests and revolts, it's usually centered on a messianic figure, a leader. What happens when that leader dies, or maybe just changes his mind? It vanishes. The protest evaporates into thin air. Not so with Sarekat Islam. Sarekat Islam, the parent organization, is there to stay. Whatever happens with individual movements, Sarekat Islam as an organization is here to stay. It has staying power. And that's what makes it so much more politically effective than your traditional rural protests. And it was also just better organized. Another key thing that it did was that it connected these rural masses with the urban elite. So the leaders of Sarekat Islam, people like Cokro Aminoto, Agus Salim, these were the Leidenline people. These were people who dreamt in Dutch. But who was the mass base? It was the Kromo. It was ordinary Javanese. And for the first time ever in colonial history, they were together in the same organization. It sort of infused a new political language, one that wasn't just about messianism, but about self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency defined in terms of us and them even. Remember how it started. We, native traders of Surakarta, are organizing, because we're all Muslim, against our competitors, Chinese and indirectly Dutch. It's a new language. It's a new kind of consciousness. And they also introduced a bunch of new political tactics that were quite new for the era: newspapers, boycotts, and rallies. And the rally part is particularly interesting. Shiraishi has this great passage where he describes the novel experience of Kromos coming to their first ever modern political rally. For the Kromo, the experiences they had were entirely novel, extraordinary, exciting, and odd. How did they start? Maybe a peasant in a village heard something about Sarekat Islam by rumors, and then they walked together with their friends all the way to a rally, and they want to see what it's all about. And this is decisive. It was a new world where the Dutch Javanese order was temporarily suspended. Again, this is a deeply socially, racially, religiously stratified society. And for a moment, these began to blur. Sarekat Islam leaders acted on equal terms with Dutch and native officials. And there's another passage where he says they didn't even have to jongkok or sembah, all these traditional signs of deference to the aristocracy, and they shocked. One of the lines was like, they were even smoking cigarettes together. Um, and not only that, they told the audience all the while that the natives, the Kromo, were brothers and that they were as human as the Dutch. This is unprecedented. This is unprecedented. And then on the spot, they paid entrance fees, joined the Sarekat Islam, and received membership cards. And just like that, they were members of a modern political organization. And then they went home. And how do you even begin to talk about this? The Dutch words that were so central to kaum muda consciousness, the sort of intellectuals leading Sarekat Islam, did not make sense for the Kromo. These elites called the rallies verkadering. Speech was called woordraat. These Dutch words don't make sense. So how did the Kromo make sense of it? They reached out and used the only words they knew, the only concepts they knew that they had to make sense of this. Ratu Adil. Cokro Aminoto, Ratu Adil. And this, I think, encapsulates beautifully sort of the hybrid nature of Sarekat Islam and how it was sort of like this transition point between these traditional rural protests and the modern mass movement that we'll eventually see. Okay, so far we've been laying down like the analytical bricks of like subalterns, experiences, and rural protest movements. Now let's finally return to history. Where we left off, Sukarno was in jail after his speech Indonesia Menggugat, and in the decades that followed, the Dutch government would just become increasingly repressive. All of these movements were savagely repressed. The major leaders, Sukarno, Hatta, Syahrir, they were all exiled. And so you kind of had this stasis where the nationalist movement was sort of on life support almost. What broke the spell? What revived it? It was the Japanese. 1939, World War II broke out. Japan enters and then enters the war after its attack on Pearl Harbor. And then I have this map here, sort of East and Southeast. These are all the territories that Japan conquered in World War II. They call it, it's very bureaucratic, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which is just an unwieldy way of saying the Japanese Empire. But within a year, they sort of like swept across this region and conquered all of these territories. My old history teacher, her dad was a Pacific War veteran, and he calls it a Japanese shitstorm. And in 1942, Japan occupies the East Indies, Indonesia. And that changes things drastically. Whereas the Dutch severely repressed the nationalist movement, the Japanese did the complete opposite. Because again, who were the Japanese enemies in World War II? It was the Allies. It was the Dutch. We're going to turn the Indies into a fortified hedgehog. If the Dutch come, we'll bleed them. How do you do that? You mobilize the Indonesian masses. And we'll see how they try to do that in the next few slides. It's important to note, though, that Japanese rule itself was exceptionally brutal. It was an immense amount of brutality that was condensed into a 2-3 year period. There's a lot of stuff they did, but I want to focus on the two major ones, forced rice deliveries and the Romusha system. So the Japanese mandated compulsory rice deliveries from all farms in Indonesia and in Bogor itself. This could go up to 40 to 75% of your crop. That's it, taken by the Japanese. And obviously this led to mass starvation, mass deaths. The death rate in Pati jumped from 22 to 45%, almost doubled. And then you have the Romusha system, which is, again, Japan was fighting a war and it needed labor. It wanted to conscript a lot of people to work on a lot of the military construction projects that were going on across, not just in the Indies, but across all of Southeast Asia. And the most infamous example one is here, the Thai-Burma Railway, sometimes called the Death Railway. Sort of you have these photographs of high, super, you can see the ribs almost of Romusha workers. And so conditions were brutal. And what they would do in the Indies, they would just take all of these Japanese peasants and like send them all over the place to build these projects. And the survival rate was less than 25%. I remember an anecdote someone told me, he actually lived through the occupation as well, that you have to remember to hormat, to bow to Japanese soldiers whenever you're passing by. He recalled once a vegetable seller forgot he was shot on the spot. So that's Japanese rule. But this, in some weird, ironic way, kind of hastened, contributed to the revolution. because it created this sense that we live in apocalyptic times. Zaman Edan. That was sort of the sense, like everything is falling apart. On a more formal level, though, was the mobilization. The Japanese actively mobilized the Indonesian masses. And these are a bunch of all the major military and paramilitary organizations that the Japanese set up during their rule. And again, these are mass organizations. The PITA, 37,000 members, and the Keibodan had more than 1 million. This was a mass organization. This wasn't just an elite body. This wasn't just a small cadre of intellectuals. This was the great mass of Indonesian society pushed into these entities. Um, and they were all, again, because they were all military and paramilitary, they were all overwhelmingly young. Members were generally around 20 years old. And so this sort of gave rise to this. Again, we often see like there's a lot of language about youth culture in Indonesia. Pemuda is important politically. And part of it is because the Indonesian Revolution was very much a Pemuda revolution. It was driven by these mass organizations. Of all of these, the most important is Pembela Tanah Air, PITA, 37,000. And the commanders, a lot of them were actually Indonesians, not Japanese. And these people would become Sudirman, the later Panglima Besar, the leader of the Indonesian army, was a PITA commander. And note the figures who were drawn: local school teachers, officials, or Islamic notables. This is the world of the Kromo. And the PITA would eventually become the nucleus of the future TNI. So the PITA is going to be very, very important. We'll revisit it again next week. But also note the name. It's not the squad of loyalty to Emperor Hirohito. It's not Rising Sun. It's Pembela Tanah Air. The Japanese are actively deploying the language of nationalism. So let's get into that a bit more. And to see sort of the spirit. What happened when you joined PITA? What did the Japanese do to you? And a lot of this was in keeping with the Japanese spirit of Bushido, right? The samurai warrior code. But what ended up happening was, turns out a lot of what we see in Bushido is quite similar to the stuff we were talking about with pasantrens and tarekats. It created this new Pemuda consciousness. So first was just the absurd shock therapy, the absurd shock of being thrown in this situation. Suhut here describes the boys had been used to drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes early in the morning, sitting in a dream with their thoughts far away. When they were forced to get up and do an early run, they couldn't control their bodies and their pants often got wet, not from sweat. Some of them lost as much as 35 pounds in the first weeks. That's 17 kilograms. This is crazy. Um, and there was also stories of like if you failed to live up to discipline, they'd like throw a shoe at you, they'd like slap you with a wooden plank over your head. So Bushido discipline. Equally interesting though is the emphasis they put on spirit. Victory or defeat. Again, not on the size of one's military forces, not on tactics, not on military sophistication, not on organization, but on what? Provided they had a burning spirit of struggle and had undergone complete training. They implanted the idea that the single most important quality of the soldier was the soldierly spirit, semangat roh keprajuritan. And again, this might sound familiar, right? This sounds like sort of the internal state that you try to cultivate in a pesantren that we were talking about, this sense of weightlessness, of elan, of inner vitality. This was similar. And that's why it probably felt familiar to a lot of the Indonesian masses. But again, this wasn't just, again, like Sarekat Islam. This wasn't just traditional. This didn't just take these templates. It transplanted them in a very modern form. Again, the Japanese did not use the language of messianism. They used the language of nationalism. These are the words of one of the trainers from PITA. Your weapons come from the Indonesian people. They are the products of the sweat of the Indonesian people, squeezed out of them by the Dutch and used for their oppression. Now, these weapons have been turned back to the sons of Indonesia themselves to be used to defend the people and the fatherland. Use them well so that the trust the people have bestowed on their sons is not betrayed. This is from a Japanese instructor training Indonesians in the PITA. again, it's just the language of nationalism. Um, Finally, even the training camps of Pita, the dojos, were kind of like pesantren. They were isolated, they were located in remote places, and they taught self-denial, meditation, and devotion to the master. These are reminiscent of pesantren and parekat. And again, this withdrawal from society, this sort of like inner strength. And I think Ben Anderson's closing line sums it up best. In the Pita, asrama power, dojo power was being concentrated, much as how it was traditionally concentrated in the pesantren, ready to be released into society when the impending crisis broke. And this was where Japan left Indonesia, this sense of tension, this position of bersiap almost, of this accumulation, this buildup of tension, of asrama power, of pita power, of dojo power, pesantren power that's ready to be released into society. And this tension starts to break in 1944 because now the end of World War II loomed near. And at this point, developments were such that everyone knew the war was over. Japan was going to lose. The Allies were going to win. Um, and I'll just briefly cover some of them a bit. All of this in 1944. First, you have Operation Overlord. The Allies, particularly the Americans and the British, they land in Normandy and they liberate Paris from the Nazis. So that's the Western Front. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union launches Operation Bagration. The Red Army decimates Army Group Center, one of the major German army formations in the Eastern Front. The way is now clear for the Red Army to punch straight through to Berlin. And so in Europe, the pincer is tightening on Nazi Germany, both from the West and from the East. The same thing is happening in the Pacific, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The American Navy completely destroys the Japanese Navy. It's virtually out of commission for the rest of the war. So that's it. The war is won. In the Pacific too. The Japanese have lost their navy. There's nothing they can do to stop the American advance. The Americans, this is the famous figure of Douglas MacArthur landing on the Philippines. I have returned. He lands in the Philippines and eventually they retake it from the Japanese, and that cuts off the rest of Southeast Asia from Japan. And so it's clear by the end of 1944 that the war is won. It's just a matter of time. The Allies have won. Japan is going to lose. And probably as a final middle finger to the Allies, the Japanese Prime Minister Koiso in September 1944 promised that the East Indies would definitely be given its independence in the future. And so this is the state of tension that we're left in. Usually when we learn in global history classes, the history of World War II, Allied victory is seen as this wonderful, great thing. Things were much more ambiguous for people in the colonies, where I don't know. Well, maybe we're not fascists, but our colonial masters are returning. And that was the state, that was the mood in the East Indies at the time. You have this promise of independence that Japan has already dangled before your very eyes. Japan has also built up this militant, radical, nationalist youth, this asrama power that's ready to be unleashed. And then now everyone knows the Allies have won. They'll be back. The Dutch will be back. But they won't return to the same Indies. They'll return to an armed hedgehog, a sort of a militant sea that is actually going to fight back in a way that it hasn't really fought back before. And so I originally had 8 more flights, but it was going to take 30, 40 more minutes. So I'm just going to end it here. So next week, we're going to basically continue from where we left off. We're going to go deeper into the national revolution. We'll explore these tensions. What happens when this Pemuda energy, this asrama power finally explodes? And we'll trace the chaos of the revolution. And really, what's often forgotten about the Indonesian Revolution, it wasn't just a conflict between Indonesians and the Dutch, it was also a conflict between Indonesians. Because the national revolution is really multiple revolutions happening at once. And they were all in conflict with each other. And so next week we'll get into this and we'll get through it and we'll try to unpack this through the political writings of two of the major figures of the revolution, Sultan Syahrir with his pamphlet Perjuangan Kita and Tan Malaka with Muslihat. And so I just wanted to put a bit of a trigger warning for the next class because the period we'll be covering is quite brutal, it's quite violent. And I think to properly do justice, we'll have to display all the content, which might be, some of which might be graphic and disturbing. Okay, thank you, everyone. As usual, questions, comments, and yeah. Okay, sorry. Questions? Anyone wants to say something? Yes. Yes. Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me? Can you go back to the pesantren slide real quick?
Share the whole screen so I can show the chat. So say something. Oh, sorry. Pesantren. This one?
Yeah, wait. Let me
Or
see.
this one? Or something else?
Yeah, these two.
These two? Okay, I'll start here.
It was very interesting how the pesantren itself was. Can you go to the next one? Sorry.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, this maaf. Maaf, punten, afwan. Ini,
Okay.
I was gonna say it's very interesting how the pesantren itself, if you contrasted it with the modern pesantren today,
Mm,
where this type of how do you call it? Like this type of close community, this type of like bertapa-ness.
Yeah.
How do I say it in English?
sort of like almost like
This withdrawal from
withdrawal.
society.
Kind of like a monasticism
Yes,
almost.
monasticism. This withdrawal from society. I was wondering, is it maybe because like from here, like if it was when they were a coming of age, right? So I would assume probably 15 or so.
Makes sense. 15,
Right, like
18,
15,
15 to
17,
20.
like, probably teenagers, right?
Right.
But nowadays, there's this type of, like when they put people in pesantren when they're very young, like
Oh, I
8
think
years
that
old.
also happened.
Oh, it
Because
also happened back
I was
then.
looking at colonial photographs and there were kids sort of like ngaji in pesantren too. So that does happen too.
Interesting to see if it's like, if it's like an actual boarding school, the way we think about pesantren the way today, versus is it like, because if it's a rural area and it's before, and tarakat usually do in little musollas, right? Like musola is right in the middle of the rice field, so like you literally just go to your guru, you do ngaji, you do like Islamic teachings, and then you go back home to your parents.
Right.
Or is it like a very contained community? That would be like that would be interesting to figure it out, and especially because I just read like a whole piece, I think, what was it, like a few days ago, where it explained about this rise of how do I say it? Conservatism lately in pesantren, and how all of that is very much linked to the kiais that are in the pesantren, where the kiais in the pesantren are usually were plucked from this line of like people who are conservative in the first place.
Right.
So that it's just became like an echo chamber almost.
Yeah.
Well, here it's a very much of a way to withdraw from society as a way of almost like a counter movement, right?
Yeah.
Like almost as we reject this, so we do this.
Right.
And that's like the history of Sufism usually echoes like that. It's like a counter resistance against the whatever regime, state, power to be that's already there. But nowadays, if you like it's very interesting seeing like the development of it.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I unfortunately can't say much. This itself, this is my first time ever doing any kind of academic reading with the Subaltern. And I'm myself, I'm a Catholic who taints the waters, so I'm not. But I think maybe an interesting question, and I don't know, maybe I hope maybe someone else, maybe Nas would want to weigh into, but maybe an interesting, maybe. Nobody's from Pesantren. Anyone from the chat? I do think that an interesting place to start looking is like, because you mentioned, oh, really?
I feel like my mom put all of my siblings to the Subaltern. Maybe you,
Except you, yeah.
I'm the first child. Maybe they not a good example. I'm like,
Right, right. Mm. Right. Yeah. So here, like, oh,
His experience.
okay.
Okay.
Wait, can we, is he on the mic? It's not on, no. Do you wanna, you don't want, okay, okay, fine.
His prayer is like almost inside the prayer. Every time.
Oh, okay, every time.
First, I went to
Mhm.
it's more like
Like a standard Islamic school almost? Okay, gotcha. Oh, okay, with modern curriculum. Okay, yeah. Mhm. Mm, right, right. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, okay. Oh,
I decided to when you think it drives like I pretend but I ended up sick anyway. I was so yeah, and I tell my mom that if I'm going back ill from this typhoid, I don't want to go. And she said
okay. Oh, okay.
yeah. I'm here now. I don't think I will be here, but I'll be somewhere in the Middle East. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, that's interesting though, because you mentioned that if you were in a pesantren, you'd end up in Egypt now. But I don't know if that was true about the if of the pesantrens in this period. Like, you don't have that like direct link where like, once you graduate from a pesantren, you go to some specific ones. Yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. Right. That makes sense. Yeah.
Like in the past, like it wasn't
It wasn't that.
yeah.
Okay.
Like what in the past, but also correct me if I'm wrong. Like as far as I know, it's because it took so much of well, like you were saying, like you guys know how the term haji, it's like it's a way of the Dutch to know who can be like a religious influencer in back in the day. Right? They have the money, to go to Hajj, they have the everything to go to Hajj and everything else, and they have time certainly. So like going abroad, like going to the Middle East to study Islam. Of course, there's some of it, but it's not like
Right. It's not.
it's
Yeah.
not like
Yeah.
equal to it.
Right. Right. And I guess at the time too, which you'll cover as well in a few months, with Islamic modernism, right? When people who come back from the Hajj, they were scandalous amongst the circles of people in Pesantrens. Like, what is this? What are you bringing to us almost? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Let me bring it up. So Megan Hewitt from iFace actually is bringing up a really good point. Let me try to put it up on the screen. Um, there we go. Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, okay. So yeah. Megan Hewitt is recommending this book by Zidofir, The Pesantren Tradition, and it describes how the alterity, how the Pesantren tradition altered in response to agrarian change in Java. So similar themes of sugar plantations and everything we've been talking about today. Okay, thank you for that. I think Oh, okay, so we just not.
Yeah, like, there are so many motors.
Yeah.
That water there is the fact that like you have it will go harder. And then for like elementary, I did SD
Alonso.
Okay.
By the way, guys, not Kakataon. You know what?
You're from Bogor.
Bogor, you know, and SMP is also Alaza. And then the high school we get to have it, guys, and so that I think you can.
Oh.
What I mean by modern is that for them specifically, they don't ask the female students what yoga.
Oh,
That's what
okay. Oh,
Like,
okay.
it's not mandatory. The way
Right.
they say it's like, it's very modern,
But
isn't it?
will you be like frowned upon by your parents, like?
No, it's like modern in the sense of the take is that, like, we're not gonna push you to do it, we want you to do it on your own well.
Mm.
So there's an option if you want to, or you
Was
can't.
everyone wearing?
Everyone, that's the thing. So like, it's very much like a thing of that's what I think, it's a very modern state. And also the others that is, you know, they're very common, yeah, so they're very also very modern. So that's why, like, it's very, I know a lot of people who are, because I did Arabic literature, right? A lot of them are from something like Golba or all of that
Traditional.
traditional. And
What's the
no, not Golba, but I mean like other ones, maybe. So look, I mean, what,
Right.
Yeah, but there is like a very modern. They,
They're Arabic, so that's.
you know, traditional, so like Western stuff. I know. Well, there's nothing. Makarami lang. Well, there's not any lang.
Oh, okay. You know,
Gunter is popular because it's like mandatory for people to speak Arabic there. So your Arabic speaking there,
okay.
like you're there for like 6, 12 years, your Arabic is like amazing at that point.
Oh, okay, interesting.
It's like they would actually, for the Arabic speaking, they would actually, not sanction, punish you. If you don't speak Arabic.
Right. Oh,
You
okay.
can get your privileges taken away.
Right, right.
Like actually, you can get your privileges taken away.
Right.
You could get like a 1 mark, 2 mark, 3 mark, and then you have to like, you don't have phone privileges because you don't speak Arabic.
Phone privilege.
24/7.
Okay.
Like stuff like that. There's like sections.
Okay, interesting.
Gontor?
Slow. Slow revision.
I don't know. I think there's a abbreviation.
Gontor is Gontor, I guess. Gontor is Gontor. Yeah, I think what? Of what?
I need to be on. Just like one foot. But you like to have album, and it's a really, there's a lot of controversy in, but something.
Oh, okay.
It ranges from it.
Oh,
Yeah.
record it?
We can pause it.
Can we?
We can.
Like,
Yeah, yeah.